The paradox of suffering among those deemed God's chosen is a profound and recurring theme across various religious narratives. This phenomenon invites contemplation on the nature of divine selection and the inherent challenges it encompasses. 1. Suffering as a divine instrument for spiritual refinement. In many religious traditions, suffering is perceived as a crucible for spiritual purification. It serves to refine character, deepen faith, and cultivate virtues such as patience and resilience. The Apostle Paul, for instance, endured immense hardships, which he viewed as integral to his divine mission. He acknowledged that his sufferings were not punitive but preparatory, molding him for greater purposes. This perspective underscores the belief that through trials, individuals are drawn closer to the divine, shedding impurities and emerging spiritually fortified. 2. Suffering as a consequence of divine favor. Paradoxically, being chosen by God can attract adversity. This selection often places individuals at odds with prevailing societal norms, leading to persecution and hardship. The Jewish experience, marked by millennia of suffering, exemplifies this. Despite being identified as God's chosen people, their history is replete with trials, suggesting that divine favor does not exempt one from suffering, but may in fact entail a unique set of challenges. 3. Suffering as a test of faith and obedience. Suffering is also viewed as a divine test, assessing the depth of one's faith and commitment. The story of Job illustrates this concept vividly. Despite his righteousness, Job faced profound losses and afflictions, challenging his faith. His unwavering trust amidst adversity is emblematic of the belief that true devotion is often proven in the crucible of suffering. This narrative reinforces the notion that enduring trials can lead to a more profound understanding of and relationship with the divine. Your daily cup of inspiration. 4. Suffering as identification with the divine. For many believers, suffering aligns them with the experiences of the divine or prophetic figures who endured hardships. In Christianity, sharing in Christ's sufferings is considered a pathway to spiritual intimacy and glory. This identification fosters a sense of purpose and hope, affirming that suffering is not in vain, but is part of a larger, redemptive narrative. 5. Suffering as a catalyst for compassion and service. Experiencing suffering can engender empathy, compelling individuals to serve and comfort others in distress. This transformative aspect of suffering enables the chosen to become instruments of divine compassion, extending grace and support to those in need. Such acts of service not only alleviate the suffering of others, but also fulfill a higher spiritual calling, embodying the principles of love and charity central to many faiths. In conclusion, the suffering of God's chosen ones is a multifaceted phenomenon that transcends simplistic explanations. It encompasses elements of spiritual refinement, consequences of divine favor, tests of faith, identification with the divine, and catalysts for compassionate action. These dimensions collectively contribute to a deeper understanding of the interplay between divine selection and human suffering, offering insights into the profound purposes that such trials may serve in the spiritual journey. 6. Suffering as a means of breaking worldly attachments. God's chosen ones are often called to live beyond the material and superficial aspects of life. Suffering can act as a divine tool to strip away excessive attachments to comfort, status, wealth, or personal ambitions. This process helps them focus on spiritual growth, dependence on God, and an eternal perspective rather than temporary pleasures. Many prophets and saints underwent extreme trials that forced them to relinquish worldly desires in favor of a higher calling. Example, the rich young ruler in the Bible was asked by Jesus to give up his wealth to follow him. Matthew 19:21. Many chosen individuals face hardships that teach them to prioritize spiritual values over material security. 7. Suffering as a battle against evil being chosen by God often means standing in direct opposition to forces of darkness. This battle brings opposition, spiritual attacks, and resistance. Evil does not attack those who are complacent, but those who are actively fulfilling God's purpose. The more aligned one is with divine will, the more likely they are to experience suffering as a result of the spiritual warfare against them. Example, Jesus himself, though sinless, faced immense suffering because he was actively working against the forces of sin and corruption. Many of his followers also faced persecution and martyrdom because they stood for righteousness. 8. Suffering as preparation for leadership and greater responsibility. Many of God's chosen ones are called to lead, guide, or influence others in significant ways. Suffering refines them, humbles them, and equips them with the wisdom, strength, and compassion needed for leadership. It ensures that they do not misuse power or become arrogant, but instead lead with a heart that understands pain and injustice. Example, Joseph in the Bible suffered betrayal, slavery, and imprisonment before he was elevated to a position of great influence in Egypt. His suffering prepared him to be a wise and compassionate ruler who saved nations from famine. 9. Suffering as a testimony to inspire others. Many of God's chosen ones endure suffering not just for their own spiritual growth, but to serve as living testimonies of faith, perseverance, and divine strength. Their struggles and triumphs become powerful examples for others, showing that faith can sustain a person even in the worst circumstances. Their lives become an encouragement to those facing similar hardships. 10. Suffering as a means to share in Christ's journey. For Christians, suffering is seen as a way to share in the experience of Christ, who endured immense pain, rejection, and crucifixion for a greater purpose. Those who are chosen are often called to walk a similar path of sacrifice and endurance, allowing them to understand Christ's heart and mission more deeply. The Apostle Paul wrote in Philippians 3:10, "I want to know Christ, yes, to know the power of his resurrection and participation in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death." Many believers see suffering as a way to connect with Christ on a deeper level. 11th, suffering as a way to keep them dependent on God. God's chosen ones often face suffering to prevent them from becoming self-reliant or prideful. When everything is going well, it's easy to forget about God and rely on personal strength. However, hardships remind them of their dependence on divine grace, strengthening their faith and trust in God's guidance. The Apostle Paul spoke about a thorn in the flesh that tormented him, 2 Corinthians 12:7-10. Despite pleading with God to remove it, Paul realized that it kept him humble and reliant on God's power rather than his own abilities. 12. Suffering as a way to fulfill a greater purpose beyond themselves. Sometimes suffering is not just about the individual, but about fulfilling a divine plan that benefits others. Some of the greatest acts of redemption, transformation, and change in history have come through the suffering of God's chosen ones. Their pain often serves a higher collective purpose that they may not even fully understand during their lifetime. Jesus' suffering and crucifixion were not for his own sake, but for the salvation of humanity. Similarly, many leaders, prophets, and saints have endured suffering that led to positive change for entire communities or generations.